The next topic is making of the Constitution, and it will be delivered by Advocate Tehmina Arora. She is a constitutional and human rights lawyer with 20 plus years of experience, with strong focus on religious freedom and minority rights. She serves as the Director of Advocacy Asia at ADF International and is the founding trustee of ADF India. She played a key role in establishing legal support for victims of violence in Kandhamal, Odisha, providing assistance to across 200 cases and work that helped shape ADF India's long-term legal aid efforts. Advocate Tehmina has also contributed to public service legal initiatives, including serving on Delhi's PCPNDT Advisory Committee. She received the Champion of Human Rights Award 2018 from the Delhi Minority Commission for her service to the community. So over to Tehmina for the topic Making of India's Constitution.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you very much for the organizers of this event. It's truly remarkable that we can sit together like this and think about our wonderful Constitution. I don't know if I will be able to see my presentation. I don't know if it's up yet. Yes, thank you so much, Brother John. I thought about, as I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to think about why the Constitution matters and how it got started. And I thought it's really remarkable when we think about why January 26th at all. And if we could go to the next slide, in 1929, in December, the Indian National Congress had a meeting where they decided that they were going to launch this call for full freedom, independence, complete independence, so Purna Swaraj. And previously, there was talk about just getting, in a sense, dominion status. And, in a sense, perhaps what you see in Australia, where there is still some not control, but at least a greater allegiance to the United Kingdom and also dominion status. But those talks fell through, and in a sense, they were scuttled. And that's when the Indian National Congress declared that, passed this resolution saying 26 Jan 1930, that's when we want full independence. It came about 17 years later. However, that's why Jan 26th is so incredibly important, because it was a movement. It represents the shift away from just being a dominion status, one of the territories, which autonomous areas, but rather full independence. And it's really historic in a sense of the journey that the independence movement took. This was when they, of course, recognized that it's going to be done in a non-violent way, but that we want full freedom. We will settle for nothing less. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. And this became important as we finally got our independence in 1947. The question then came was, how do we govern this nation? What will be the values? What will be the emphasis? What will it look like? How do we shape it? And that's why the Constitution plays such an important role. It is foundational to the very idea of India. It is India's commitment to the rule of law that is grounded in this Constitution, which establishes India as a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. So the Constitution is obviously the supreme law of the land. It governs how the union's powers, the state's powers, the institutions' powers, how they relate to each other. It guarantees individual rights, fundamental rights, even community rights, looks at duties, thinks about state policy, thinks about how states will interact with each other. And this is the law on which our entire nation is premised. How we deal with each other, how we deal with the state, how the state deals with us, and how the state deals with other local bodies, all finds grounding in this. And this was an important exercise, if we could move to the next slide, because India was not one thing. India needed a constitution because of the long colonial rule, the multiple kingdoms that had existed prior to that, And there was a unification effort that was needed at the very time when India was being declared the sovereign socialist secular democratic republic. That movement required a constitution because we were not all on the same page. We did not have an idea of human dignity. What would it mean for Dalits, for women, for tribals, or to sit along across the table and discuss what does it mean for the future. And that's why the constitution making process and the constitution implementation process is such a useful project for us as a nation. Because we were, on one hand, we were saying there's rule of law and there will no longer be an authoritarian regime. And also we were saying that everyone is equal in this table. So there was a diversity, but there was also an establishment on the rule of law. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So a groundbreaking achievement comes in as the first law, frameworks are being created, the transition, and especially as we think about the making process, if you think about the Constituent Assembly debates, how revolutionary this was. And I just want to, I mean, there are various aspects of the Constitution, but I just especially want to think about the role of Christians in that entire process and the value that was being given to a very minuscule population at the time of the constitution making. I think about a very, very contentious issue just now in our nation about religious conversions. And even something that is so contentious now and was contentious even at that time was debated thoroughly during the constitution making. And it was on, if I'm looking at my notes now, but on the 6th of December 1948 was when we discussed, or the Constituent Assembly members discussed the issue of conversion. And there was this very fierce debate on whether we should include the word propagate in our fundamental rights, the fundamental freedoms under Article 25, then Article 19. Should it be included or not? And there was a very fierce debate where people said, please, we've already given a lot of freedom under the freedom of speech and expression. Don't include propagation in this. And it was senior leaders, I would say Hindu leaders, who stood up and said, what is being shared just now, and I'll read it clearly, that the right to propagate was granted to persons of all communities, so that a voluntary conversion was the exercise of an individual's freedom of conscience, and that citizens who are driven to conversion must retain the right to do so. So really protecting that in spite of opposition, thinking about a very tiny population. And that's what is so incredible about this document, that it took into account these small populations, people, in tribal belts, who did not have access to education or resources. The Constitution was thinking, and the Constituent Assembly was thinking about those. And it's a remarkably long document. If we could move to the next slide. It took over 2 years to build, close to 3 years actually, several articles. People joke, how many of us on this call, including all the lawyers, we have read it cover to cover? Do we know all the articles? Have we read it? And many of us, I confess, I haven't read it cover to cover, but it's a long document and it has several provisions within it. But I think what is the most remarkable piece of the Constitution is actually it has stood the test of time. When we think about our neighboring countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, all had an opportunity around the same time, excluding Nepal, to think about their own constitutions, to frame their constitutions. And sadly, those constitutions have not stood the test of time. Over and over again, Nepal, that started its Constituent Assembly much later in time, has already had about 4 iterations of their constitution. But it's remarkable that our constitution has stood that test. Yes, there have been changes, amendments introduced, but it has held strong, protecting the rights of the most vulnerable. And if we could go to the next slide, please. And starting from the 9th of December, 1946, when the first meeting, and then to the final implementation, or rather the implementation on the 26th of January, 1950. So a remarkable journey in lots of intense discussion, but like I said, holding steady through the years. If we could move to the next slide. And it was not only a long process where they debated internally, but rather it was a process that really drew in from various constitutions. We had people within the Constituent Assembly who were looking, engaging internationally, and they were thinking about what is working across the world, whether it was in the UK, in the US, in Ireland, in Canada, in France, and of course, drawing from the Government of India Act of 1935, which is really the foundation of it, but drawing from these countries and incorporating what they believed was the best aspects and creating frameworks that, like I said, have lasted. But there is another process that was going on, if we could go to the next slide, that was incredibly important in our constitution's shaping. And indeed, not only shaping our constitution, but in India, shaping the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Both these documents were being framed around the same time. And India was drawing from the discussions that were taking place at the UDHR that led to the enactment of the UDHR. And likewise, Indians who were participating in those discussions in the drafting committee of the UDHR were contributing there. And there is a beautiful intermingling that has taken place. And the UDHR, which talks about human dignity, talks about the principles of basic human rights, and recognizes that each person has that dignity, shaping it as soft law, of course, but then through the constitutions and then through the various international conventions, bringing that into the law of the land. And the Supreme Court has also recognized how incredibly important both this process has been, the UDHR and the Indian Constitution shaping each other. But if we could go to the next slide, please. And some of the key features that safeguard human dignity, and we will be listening to that, so I won't dwell too much in, but the fundamental rights. This is the first time that all citizens were recognized as having equal dignity, equality, the lack of, or rather the protection of human dignity in the face of casteism. So recognizing that untouchability was to be abolished, recognizing that everyone has the right to life and that the procedure established under law should be followed, the right to freedom of movement, the right to freedom of speech and expression, the right to religion, all being incorporated into that. And then also thinking about what does the state look like in the future? What should be the guidelines that will direct how state policy will be? And the independence of the judiciary, making sure that the courts are able to speak into this, are able to safeguard the Constitution. And of course, recognizing that there will be changes that will be required that allows the Constitution to breathe, in a sense, to make move. There's enough play in the joints so that the Constitution is able to protect, to establish rule of law in our nation. And Robin has already shared the preamble, which if we could go to the next slide, but just such beautiful principles brought in: liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, justice, social, economic, and political equality of status and opportunity, and fraternity. Dr. Ambedkar, as he spoke at the closing of the Constituent Assembly, it's one of his last speeches that he made. And he was talking about how do we safeguard this Constitution? What does it mean? And what are some of the dangers? And he warned us, and those are the three warnings that I think still apply. We must be very, very careful. The first was that we must do everything we can to hold fast to the constitutional methods to achieve our social and economic objectives. Constitutional methods, not violence. Within the Constitution, there is enough to protect us, to ensure that we have rights. So holding fast to those constitutional methods. The second thing that he warned us about was not to lay our liberties at the feet of even great men. He recognized that there is a very strong hero worship or bhakti movement, like he said, for political leadership in our country. And he said that we must be very, very careful that we do not leave or lay at the feet of these people our liberties. But the third thing that he said, which is what Robin was talking about also, was that we cannot merely contend with political democracy. What we need is social democracy. We require that these rights that are so beautifully enshrined, justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, enshrined in our constitution, must mean real things to real people, to the people on the ground. And he said the key to this was fraternity. He said there is a beautiful interaction between liberty, equality, and fraternity. That without liberty from equality, if liberty is divorced from equality, then it would mean that we are free to do things, but it would result in anarchy. But if equality was divorced from liberty, it would lead to a lack of free enterprise. And yet, as you bring fraternity into the mix with liberty, equality, and fraternity, it means that you don't need to have the state watching over you. As equal citizens, we are able to speak into the life of our nation, and we are able to challenge and encourage each other. We are able to look out for each other. And that, he said, was the true measure of our nation. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, but I think this is such an incredible opportunity for us in our nation's history just now, where fraternity is being whittled away. What does it mean through music, through the arts, through dialogue? How do we build fraternity so that liberty and equality can truly flourish in our nation? But I thank you again for this opportunity. Looking forward to having more discussions later. Handing back to Rahul. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that excellent overview of the making of the Constitution. You did mention about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights around 1948 and our Article 21. It also has something to do with the end of Second World War. Post Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasting, Japan amended its constitution, came out with a new constitution in 1948. And Article 31 of the Japanese constitution is exactly what we have in Article 21 of the Indian constitution. Also, you mentioned about fundamental rights, Bill of Rights. In fact, the US Constitution, when it was framed, it did not have the Bill of Rights. It was made by an amendment subsequently, but we have the good fortune of having the Bill of Rights all embedded there. And the most unique thing about our fundamental rights is Part 3, Article 32, where you have a fundamental right to enforce your fundamental rights. And that is very important. That's the most unique thing in the Indian Constitution.